Welcome, welcome, welcome. So glad to be here with all of you tonight. Yet another late night conversation. I do the noon conversations and then I do the late night conversations. Now, tomorrow, that's not the case. I'm doing the podcast tomorrow. But anyway, long story short, we're going to do yet another late night stream. So hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. Let's do it.
The American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, 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 everyone. So glad to have you all here tonight. The way we do things, for those of you who may not be familiar, is that I give my opening remarks, whatever it is I want to talk about, and then that is followed by a roll call where I call you all out as I see you. We find out who's on the other side of the camera, who's watching, and then after that, I answer your questions for the rest of the night. So you can keep me on here all night if you want. You can just keep asking questions until the cows come home, as they say. It should be fun. So you got something you want me to talk about, I'll make note of it here. You can send me a super chat on YouTube. You can send me a Rockfin tip or a Rumble rant. I tend to do Rumble rants first, Rockfin tips second, and super chats third. That's the way I tend to do things. So if you got something you want me to talk about in the second half of our program, by all means, send me a super chat and I will make a point of answering it. So I'm going to get into my opening remarks for tonight, which is a topic I am very excited to talk about. But before I get to that, I do want to remind you all that we are having the National Convention of the Center for Political Innovation. That is taking place on December 2nd. And that is in Portland, Oregon. And we need you to be there. It is going to be amazing. It's going to be an amazing anti-imperialist mega indoor rally. I was just talking to people in California today about who are going. I was just on a meeting with Elizabeth Young and a few other people about another connected event. And it's going to be really, really something special. You don't want to miss this. You want to be there. Make your travel arrangements. Make a point of being there. Garland Nixon's going to be there. Scott Ritter is going to be there. Jody Brar is going to be there. Nick Brana of the People's Party. It's going to be an amazing, absolutely amazing event. You're really, really going to love it. And I really hope you can be there. If you want to send us a donation, you can do that. I have the link below in the chat. And I'll drop the link here. If you want to send a donation to help us do the event, that is awesome. All donations are appreciated. It does cost a lot, but I think that we are going to have a great event. It's gonna be something, but we're going to do it, and we are ready to do it. The country is ready for it. So we are really excited for this event. I hope you will join us. Make note. All right. Now, folks, tonight for my opening remarks, I want to talk about a topic that I have done a lot of reading about lately. And I want to talk about it because it's something that the more I've investigated it, the more I've realized how highly relevant it is to what we are living under right now. And you wouldn't think it would be related, but it's heavily related to what we are doing and what we are living in and the struggles we are going through in our time. And that event is the English Civil War. It's interesting. I never learned anything about the English Civil War when I was in school. I learned about the French Revolution, learned about the American Revolution, I learned about the American Civil War, but I never learned about the English Civil War. Very few people in the United States, and even in England, know very much about the English Civil War. But I've been reading about the English Civil War and learning about it because it is highly relevant to understanding where we're at. It's very, very, very relevant in our time. And I'm going to talk tonight about the English Civil War. And I'm going to talk about it in a way that utilizes Marxist materialism, but also utilizes other ways of understanding history, because I want you to understand the English Civil War from the perspective of somebody who wants to understand how history moves forward, from the perspective of somebody who wants to make a better world, and not from the perspective of good guys and bad guys, because there's too much internet virtue signaling these days. You know, people just trying to show that they're good, that they're moral. And if you look at an event like the English Civil War, this is a very complex event that happened. It's a dynamic, pivotal event in the history of Western civilization. Very, very important. Very relevant in the history of the United States, as I'll get to later. Very relevant in the history of Britain, but in the history of the world. It's a very, very important event, the English Civil War. But if you look at it in terms of who are the good guys and who are the bad guys, you're going to be disappointed, because there's a lot of bad all around. There's a lot of bad all around in the English Civil War. But it was a moment where history marched forward and doors were opened and things happened. There were divisions among the rulers, and those divisions called forth movements among the people. It is very, very relevant to what we are doing and going through right now. And so let us talk about the English Civil War. In the 1600s in Britain, the state religion was the Church of England. Now, the Church of England was technically Protestant. It was not Catholic, but the Protestant Reformation had come to Britain differently than it came to the rest of Europe. We all know the Protestant Reformation in Switzerland and in Germany. You had Martin Luther nailing his thesis to the church wall. You had Ulrich Zwingli. You had, open defiance of the Catholic Church, people translating the Bible into their own languages. That's how the Protestant Reformation happened on the European mainland. But in Britain had broken with the Catholic Church in a very different way. King Henry VIII, he had wanted to get divorced, and the Pope wouldn't let him. So he cut ties with Rome, with the Vatican. You're on the list. He cut ties with Rome, and he established the Church of England. And the Church of England was not that different than the Catholic Church. It had priests. It had a lot of elaborate rituals. Priests were allowed to get married. And there were some other changes in the Church of England. But the Church of England was more or less the Catholic Church watered down. It wasn't the Lutheran Church. It wasn't Anabaptist reformers. It was just a version of the Catholic Church that would allow King Henry VIII to get married. It was the Church of England. And it was the state religion. And it's still the state religion in Britain, mind you, right? I mean, you'll notice in Britain, wings of the government are referred to as ministries, right? They have the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education. Well, that's because the government in Britain is technically combined with the Church of England. And it was the state religion. And back in the 1600s, it was a crime not to attend church. If you didn't attend church, you could be fined. You could be publicly whipped. It was a crime. They kept attendance at church, and if you were not there, you violated the law. And at that time, the Church of England upheld that the king was allowed by God to rule, that he had divine right, that the King of England had been appointed by God to rule over the world, the country. right? Just as the church had been appointed by God to rule over humanity, the king had been appointed by God to rule over the nation. And it was taught by the Church of England that to oppose the king was a great sin against God. And the church was a mechanism through which the aristocracy, those are the landlords, the nobles, and the king, it was a method through which they ruled over the country. Everyone was required to go every Sunday. They learned that the king had divine right and ruled over them. It was the state religion, the Church of England. However, feudalism, the economic system where you have serfs on the land and you have landlords, that system was in decline. And in London, the capital city, and in many of the urban centers, there was a vibrant capitalist economy that was developing in Britain at the time. You had factories where people worked and created products that were sold. You had stores, and you had a vibrant capitalist economy. You had a working class of people who sold their labor power, rented themselves out, and got a wage. They weren't serfs on the land. They were wage workers. You had people who lended money. You had factory owners, and you had a capitalist economy developing in the urban centers. But in the countryside, you more or less still had the remnants of feudalism. You had peasants that were on the land. You had nobles who ruled over them. The Church of England and the king were defenders of the old feudal order. They were loyal to the old feudal system, whereas the capitalists in the city, they were critical of the feudal system. And there started to be a big divide in the rulers of Britain between the feudal aristocracy and the emerging capitalist class. And they were at odds with each other. And the king frequently sided with the feudal aristocracy, and the parliament that was elected officials tended to side with the capitalist class. And they started fighting with each other about all kinds of issues. One of them was that the king would levy taxes without the permission of the parliament. You can imagine all the capitalists didn't particularly appreciate that. This king just declares, you got to pay some taxes, and they don't get any say on it. There's no vote. There's nothing. Another thing was that the king declared, since he's the king of the country, that he could take land from anybody. So these wealthy capitalists would own some big tract of land, and then the king would step in and say, nope, mine, and he would take it. And there was no due process through which they could oppose it. And there was this power struggle between the king and the parliament that was taking place. And the Church of England was the institution that propped up the rule of the king. And increasingly, the King of England, because he was critical of the emerging capitalist system, he increasingly started to become more friendly with Roman Catholic countries, because the Roman Catholic countries were countries where feudalism hadn't been dismantled. And he started befriending Catholic countries. And then to top it all off, he actually married a Roman Catholic, King Charles I. And so you have this situation where you have the feudal system, remnants of the feudal system, the king, the landowners, the nobles in the countryside, the Church of England. But then in the cities, you have this emerging capitalist economy. And the capitalist class of Britain that was emerging was increasingly wanting to push back against the power of the king. And the power of the king was largely backed up with the Church of England. So what did the emerging capitalist class do? They fomented religious movements to oppose the Church of England. And the first of these religious movements was called the Puritans, right? And that's a big part of American history, but we'll get to that later. But why were they called the Puritans? Because they wanted to purify the Church of England. They felt that the Church of England was not following the Bible. They felt that the Church of England was engaging in all kinds of, semi-Catholic rituals. And so you had this movement called the Puritans that emerged, and they stayed in the Church of England, but they wanted to force the Church of England to reform itself and purify itself. But then, after a while, it became clear the Church of England was not going to change. So you had a number of different groups that formed that were called separatists or dissenters. And these were people who quit the Church of England and started their own church in defiance of the law, which you have to remember back then it was the law. You had to be a member of the Church of England. Well, these people defied the law. They said, we're not going to be part of the Church of England. And there were various groups that were formed, and they were all being supported by the capitalist class. The urban capitalists wanted to push back against feudalism. So they were giving money and allowing various movements of religious dissenters to emerge to push back against the Church of England. And this is really important because this is how revolutions tend to start. There's a fight among the rich and powerful, right? The rich and powerful are fighting. In this case, it's the feudal rich versus the capitalist rich, and they're fighting with each other. And they realize that in order to win, they've got to get the people on their side. And so a division in the ruling class creates an opening for the people. And because the capitalists of Britain didn't want the Anglican Church to rule over them, they started fomenting religious dissenters. In addition to that, they started fomenting democratic activism and populist activism and all kinds of activism among the working class of the cities. What's interesting was the printing press was a very new invention back then, right? It was a very, very new invention. But people were shocked about how in London, thousands and thousands of pamphlets were being distributed, putting forward different ideas about how society should change, because the capitalists needed to foment radical sentiment to push back against feudalism. And a lot of these movements emerged in London and in the urban cities that were made up of different types of radicals that wanted to mobilize the common people. Sometimes these movements were explicitly religious, and sometimes they were more political, but often they kind of overlapped. And there were a number of religious and political movements that emerged in the 1640s as the capitalists were kind of fomenting and opening up radical discussion, democratic empowerment as a way to push back against the monarchy. One of the movements that emerged was called the Levelers, and it was a group that wanted to greatly expand the right to vote. Now, they didn't want universal suffrage. They didn't want every member of every citizen, every man to be able to vote, but they wanted to greatly expand the right to vote. At the time, only those who owned property. You had to own a piece of land in order to vote. But they argued that it should be greatly expanded, like people in the military should be able to vote. They had a list of people that should be able to vote. And the Levelers, they were called, they published a manifesto. And they published this manifesto, the Levelers Manifesto. And members of the movement, they wore these hats, and they would put the manifesto in their hat as their symbol. It was fascinating. And they would march around, and the hat had this little manifesto, this little pamphlet in their hat, and that was their symbol. They were Levelers. There was a group called, we know what the Quakers are. George Fox was a religious leader at the time, and he argued that one could hear the voice of God within oneself, and that you had what he called the light within. And he was a pacifist, but he also believed that you had the light within. And he went around preaching what we now understand to be the religion of Quakerism, or the Society of Friends. You had a number of movements that were formed. There was a group called the Ranters, and they advocated sexual freedom. They were pantheists. They didn't believe in the Bible. They didn't believe in Christianity, but they believed in sexual freedom, and they were called the Ranters. And they went around promoting their religious belief, calling for sexual freedom. And they were widely hated by other people. They thought they were a bunch of crazy, degenerate, sexual, immoral people. And there were all these religious movements, political movements that were being fomented. And it was an upsurge of democratic participation. They had big debates. in these big churches in London. Thousands and thousands of people would pile in to listen to debates that would go on for hours about whether or not the vote should be expanded, who should get to vote, how they should change the Constitution. There was a huge democratic upsurge in the urban centers of Britain. And ultimately what happened was that the Parliament and the king split apart. The king was saying that he should be able to continue levying taxes and seizing land. And the Parliament was saying, no, you can't. And the actual army of Britain was siding with the king. So the Parliament had to form its own army. And so they formed their own army. It was called the New Model Army. And it was a highly political army. Because most people that were just going to join the army would join the regular army. But the New Model Army, they called it, was a very political army. Now, the leader of the New Model Army was a member of Parliament named Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell was, kind of a wealthy guy he'd spent most of his life being kind of depressed and suicidal, and he had really no purpose in life. But he had a religious awakening. He said that God spoke to him. He had a religious awakening, and he became a Puritan. And he was convinced that the Church of England was a Catholic conspiracy against Britain. And he was elected to Parliament, where he was a harsh critic of the king. And he was the guy who went out and built and organized this group called the New Model Army. And the New Model Army that was formed was led by Oliver Cromwell. And Oliver Cromwell, he was a religious fanatic. And he was a very effective military leader, but he led an army of many different factions. Every one of these different religious groups had its own wing of the army. The levelers would march into battle with their hat with the manifesto in it. They would march into battle. And this should remind you of something, right? This should really remind you of something, because you'll remember that in China, somebody else centuries later formed a very political army. And every soldier had a little book with a statement of principles in it. And it was this mass mobilization, this mass upsurge of democratic participation that was happening in Britain as the rulers were fighting against each other. And Oliver Cromwell became the main leader of the forces that were opposed to the King of England. And ultimately, they won the war. And the King of England was charged with treason. The King of England was charged with treason, and he was found guilty for having said he had divine right. And they executed the King of England. And the King of England, Charles I, got his head cut off. And it was a really big moment in history. And there were some wild times that in the lead up to it. For example, apparently, the King of England, when he was captured, when he was on trial, he had a cane. He walked with a cane, and the cane had a knob on the top of it. And he dropped the knob in the courtroom. And he dropped it, and it fell on the ground. And then there was dead silence in the courtroom. And there was dead silence in the courtroom because for the first time in the king's life, no one was going to pick up the knob for him. And that was like the realization, this guy ain't the king anymore. He dropped the knob of his cane, it fell, and there was dead silence in the courtroom, and everyone looked on. No one's picking things up for this guy anymore. He's not the king anymore. And ultimately, the King of England received the death penalty. He got his head cut off for being a heretic, for advocating that he rule, saying he had divine right. They cut his head off. And Oliver Cromwell became basically the military dictator. Interesting fact is that Britain has no constitution at this time. They have the bylaws of their parliament, but they've never had a constitution. The only time they ever had a constitution was when Oliver Cromwell was running Britain. And the constitution, he was written into the constitution as the Lord and Protector. That was his title. He wasn't the king. He was the Lord and Protector of Britain. And Oliver Cromwell became the king. And he ruled. And a lot of amazing things happened during the English Civil War. For example, 1649, that's the year that the king got his head chopped off. One of these religious sects were socialists. Fascinating. There was a group called the True Levelers, or the Diggers, and they were socialists. And they were working class people who said exploitation was wrong, that capitalism and private property were wrong. And they seized an area called St. George's Hill, and they started, setting up a socialist society. And they seized control of it. That happened. And why did it happen? It happened because the capitalists were having to foment this mass movement. It was a wild situation, right? The army that was fomented, the new model army that was fomented to fight against the King of England, against the official British army. Their nickname, they called the soldiers the Roundheads. That's what they were called. They were called Roundheads. And you know why that was? It's because they all had short hair. And they had short hair because only rich people could have long hair. Rich people back then had long hair. They had locks. They called it the locks of a gentleman. But the poor people, they couldn't afford to have fancy locks that they kept to look all fashionable. The poor people just got short hair like everybody else. So the slur for the new model army is they called them the Roundheads, or the Roundhead army, because they were working class people. They were poor people who were mobilized to fight for their rights. And they believed in democracy. They believed in expanding the right to vote, and they believed in religious freedom. And many of them, it was on the one hand, this was a struggle between the emerging capitalist class and the remnants of feudalism. On the other hand, it was a political struggle. They were motivated by a belief in democracy, expanding, suffrage and the right to vote, democratic participation. But there was a spiritual aspect to it as well, because the Church of England had a very routine proceeding, right? Its rituals were all very regimented. They lit the candle here, they said this incantation and all of that. But the various dissenters that emerged, these were people who believed, usually all of them to some degree or other, believed you could have a direct relationship with God. You could feel the light of God within you. You could have religious experiences on your own. I guess George Fox, the founder of the Quakers, he apparently claimed he could do miracles. He could heal people. And George Fox, this founder of the Quakers, went around healing people. And that there were so many of these dissenters. There were many, many of these religious sects. There was one called the Muggletonians. They were Anabaptists. There were a number of these religious sects that were formed. And most of them believed that one could have some kind of spiritual direct connection with God, that the Church of England was cutting off people from having a direct spiritual religious experience. And that they were kind of unleashing a spiritual power and a fanaticism that was in the population, that they felt that the routine and authoritarian structure of the Church of England was holding back. It's very beautiful, and if you read what these people wrote, right, that these people, these various religious dissenters, these sects, these fanatical Protestant sects that made up the new model army that brought Oliver Cromwell to power, they were people that were just exploding with passion, right? They could feel God's presence in their soul. They were angry that any king would claim that God had put him on the throne. They were angry that anyone would tell them that they had to talk to God through the Church of England. They wanted to feel that passion themselves. They wanted to pray directly. They wanted to wrangle with moral and spiritual questions. They wanted widespread debate in society about what was right and wrong. This was an upsurge of democracy. You're on the list. It was an upsurge of democratic participation. It was an upsurge of spirituality. It was a mass religious revivalism that spread through Britain and laid the basis for ultimately the King of England to get his head cut off, and for the capitalist class to triumph over feudalism. And if you look at that moment, what happened? Well, of course, after a few years, Oliver Cromwell was in power and he started cracking down on it. It had gone too far. And this happens in every revolution. It's called the Thermidor, right? And the French Revolution, it was the month in the French Revolutionary calendar when the Reign of Terror came to an end, right? And that this happens in every revolution. The door opens and there's mass upsurge of democratic participation. The people are in motion, but then the new order comes into power and the new order starts to dampen things down. And that happens in every revolution. And the diggers who seized St. George's Hill, they were executed and they were killed. And there was a brutal repression of the diggers. There was brutal repression of the ranters for sexual immorality. Some of them got the death penalty for having, different sex partners and things like that. And, that after a few years, this huge democratic, spiritual, religious, revolutionary upsurge among the British working class, it started to tone down. And that was the English Civil War. And you ask, why is this important? Well, I'll tell you, it's important for one particular reason, but several others as well. The first reason that it's very important to what we're doing now is because of the fact that, do you know what happened after the revolutionary upsurge and after the Puritans and the Quakers and the ranters and the diggers, and after the English bourgeoisie started tampering down on this revolutionary movement it had fomented for its own reasons? Where did they go? Where did they go? What happened? What did they do? They came here. Yeah, they came here. Who do you think settled Massachusetts? Those were the Puritans. Pennsylvania. What is Pennsylvania named after? It's named after William Penn, who was the successor of George Fox, the leader of the Quakers. All of these religious fanatics, these people who had been caught up in the revolutionary upsurge of religious fervor, democratic participation, in some cases even socialism, in the case of the diggers and the true levelers, these folks, as they saw the revolutionary energy was dying in Britain, and as the capitalists that they had fought for were now suppressing them, they got on a boat and they came to America. The Puritans founded Massachusetts. That's who the Pilgrims were. They were Puritans. And who, the Quakers, who were they? They were followers of George Fox. And the founding of America, these very people who got involved in the huge uprising to topple King Charles I, it was their kids and grandkids who were keeping that revolutionary tradition alive that started the United States of America. The United States of America was largely founded by people who kept the flame of the English Civil War going. It was revolutionaries, fanatical religious people, and revolutionary Protestants, full of religious passion, full of democratic ideals, full of a desire to build God's kingdom on earth, full of a desire to connect to God directly and have direct religious and spiritual experiences. That's who founded America. Now, we can talk about the awful things they did to the Native Americans, and we're very opposed to that, obviously. These people weren't perfect. But it was that upsurge of democracy, and it was that upsurge of spirituality that laid the basis of the founding of the American Republic. Think about that. However, it's important for yet another reason. It's important because we're now, hundreds of years later, we're in an oddly similar situation. Right now, obviously, feudalism is gone. But right now, there's a division in the ruling class, just like there was a division in the English ruling class. And the divide is somewhat similar. Under feudalism, the feudal landowners wanted to keep things as they were. They said, we can only have, You peasants, you work the land, I own the land, and we're satisfied with it. Whereas the capitalists were the ones that said, no, we want to build, we want to construct, we want to make more profits, we want new technology, we want to advance. That was the divide. You had the stagnant feudal aristocracy that was stuck in the past and stuck in tradition and just wanted to stagnate and keep everything as it was. And you had the emerging capitalist class that believed in progress and growth, etc. That same divide is happening in our ruling class right now. Joe Biden and the tech monopolies and the World Economic Forum more or less have the attitude of the feudal aristocracy. They want to drive down living standards. They want to stop historical progress, and they want to go backward. They say smaller is better, less is more. And they're trying to do that in order to preserve the existing system. They are opposed to social progress. In order to save capitalism, they want degrowth, and they want to make a highly regimented society in order to stifle human growth and to hold back historical progress. That's what the World Economic Forum and Klaus Schwab and all of them want. Whereas the lower levels of capital want to make money, and they believe growth is good, and they believe in the American dream of working hard and growing wealthy and constructing and advancing new technology. And it seems like, once again, we have a situation where we have the Church of England and the old ruling order battling against people who believe in growth and construction. There's a similar divide in our ruling class. And if you look at it, it's also, what was the Church of England? What was the King of England? It was this old, dying institution. People just going through the motions. People who didn't really believe in anything anymore. Corrupt, decaying institutions. People like Nancy Pelosi. People like Sleepy Joe Biden. People like Dianne Feinstein. This decaying, corrupt, bureaucratic institution that is saying, no more growth. Growth is bad. That was on the one side. And then on the other side, you had people that were imbued with spiritual power, that believed in growth and optimism, that wanted to construct, that were talking about, in some cases, talking about socialism, that were talking about having religious experiences, that were full of passion. That was the divide. It's almost like we're having the English Civil War all over again. And, mind you, where is the power behind Joe Biden, the power behind the neo-feudal degrowth faction? Where is it headquartered? London. The World Economic Forum, the Club of Rome, all of this is London. This is the British Empire. This is the English aristocracy. This is the Eastern establishment. This is the New England old money wealth trying to hold back historical progress, facing off against another section of the ruling elite that want to make money. But then that raises the question, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen next? Because we know that when the capitalists fight with each other, the next stage is they start recruiting workers into mass movements to be their foot soldiers. And just like in 1649, that when they opened the door to create a mass movement, it led to some very exciting developments. The new model army, the diggers seizing St. George's Hill. It led to a huge opening through which the desire of the people for justice and truth and participation and wrangling and debate, they opened the door. And out of that door walked all kinds of things that were a threat even to the original capitalists. And mind you, the English Civil War, what was a major factor in making it happen? this new technology called the printing press. There's this thing called the printing press, and all of a sudden people could spread their ideas in a way that they couldn't before. People were printing pamphlets. Pamphlets were revolutionary. And all over London, people were handing each other pamphlets to read about democracy, to read about religion, to read about different concepts. The means of information had expanded. And with the means of information in their hands, the emerging capitalist class was able to mobilize forces on their side. Well, what are we living in right now? A huge expansion in the means of information. Computer technology, the internet, the fact that I'm broadcasting to you right now, ranting about the English Civil War. I'm not a ranter. It's because of a huge breakthrough in technology. So we're living in a period that very much mirrors the English Civil War. And that there's a division in the ruling class. There's a new mechanism for disseminating information that's available. And among the people, there is starting to be unrest and anger and a desire to assert themselves amid all of this unrest. And the point of division among the elite is the same point of division. Do we hold on to what's there and we just hold things back and everyone just has their place and it stays there? Or do we believe in growth and hope and optimism? Do we advance spiritually? Do we arise and talk about democratic empowerment? We're living in the English Civil War. This is the English Civil War 2.0. But who's Oliver Cromwell? Who's George Fox? Who are the Diggers? Who are the Ranters? Where are the Roundheads? Where's the New Model Army? We're living in the English Civil War, folks. We are living in the English Civil War. In a weird way, we are living in an updated, high-tech version of the English Civil War. And I want to tell you why this is so important. When we talk about Christianity, and we talk about Christianity and socialism, overwhelmingly, the way this topic is discussed is in a Catholic way. That's because of Latin America. It's because of the Cuban Revolution, because of Bolivarianism. And generally, Protestantism is associated with free market capitalism. Generally, right? Many people point out that the Protestant Reformation very much became an expression of the emerging capitalist class. And because of that, the Catholic Church made vaguely anti-capitalist statements against the Protestant Reformation, right? The Catholic Church condemned money. It said that money was sterile. The Catholic Church, the Catholic Church, because of it is a remnant of feudalism. It had a vague conservative anti-capitalism about it. And that is the way that Christian socialism has generally expressed itself in recent times, right? Christian socialism in the 20th century has largely been in the form of Catholic, utilizing the Catholic teaching that is a critique of money, that is a critique of capitalism from a feudal perspective, utilizing that to form some kind of solidarity with socialism. And I'm not Catholic, and I'm not from Latin America. And in Latin America, Father Romero, Daniel Ortega, these folks have done great things with that. I'm not knocking that, but that's not America. That's not America, right? I mean, we have plenty of Catholic people in America, but that's not the American spirit, right? The American spirit is a very different thing. But if you look at the Diggers and you look at the early American socialist communes, you'll see a very different brand of Christian socialism. You'll see a Christian socialism that is very optimistic, that believes in growth, that doesn't identify with feudalism, but rather identifies with the revolutionary movements to destroy feudalism. You'll find a Christian socialism that has that passion and that spirituality in it that you saw in the English Civil War. And that is a brand of Christian socialism that is just waiting to flourish in the United States. Liberation theology has its place. And if you're Roman Catholic, I encourage you to explore liberation theology, right? Nothing wrong with that. But for Protestant Americans, for people who believe one can have direct spiritual experiences, that one can communicate with God on one's own, we can have a personal relationship with Jesus. For those who believe in economic growth, those who believe in a better tomorrow and optimism, liberation theology just doesn't hit, doesn't strike a chord, because it is a very Catholic phenomenon. Liberation theology is very much a Catholic thing. But there is another form of Christian socialism that you can find, talk about Robert Owen, who started the city of New Harmony. City of New Harmony in Indiana. It was a socialist city that he established. Robert Owen, the first guy to use the word socialism in the English language. There's many Christian socialists in the early years of the English Civil War and in the early years of this country. You can read about, various Christian socialist communities that were established in the United States. And that, if there's going to be, and I've talked on here endlessly about the Second Great Awakening. So we know at the time that the American Revolution happened, right? In the lead up to the American Revolution, there was a mass religious revival movement called the Great Awakening. Jonathan Edwards was a big figure in it. But then in the lead up to the American Civil War, you had the Second Great Awakening. And the Second Great Awakening happened with Charles G. Finney, who's my ancestor, and a number of religious leaders going around and condemning the practice of slavery and urging people to repent and arguing that America was moving in a sinful direction and that the ship had to be turned around. We had to move away from slavery, and that the emerging industrial capitalist class of the United States fomented the Second Great Awakening of fanatical Protestantism, tent revival meetings, etc., as a way to set the stage for the eventual fight to defeat slavery. And that John Brown, the great heroic slave revolutionary in the United States who led the raid on Harper's Ferry, John Brown was a product of the Second Great Awakening, right? He was motivated by his religious faith to seize Harper's Ferry, take hostages, etc. And that the Second Great Awakening, if you look at it, the Second Great Awakening was just a continuation of the English Civil War. And the point of division in the Second Great Awakening was the same as it is now. The slave system, the slave owners didn't want industrialization. They wanted to maintain an agrarian economy. They wanted to become the supplier. They wanted America to just be a bunch of slave plantations to supply the British with the cotton that they needed and the tobacco that they needed. They didn't want America to become industrialized. Whereas Abraham Lincoln and Henry Charles Carey and Henry Clay and people like that, they did want industrialization of the United States. And they rejected the financial system that was emerging from Britain. And so there was a clash between the slave system of the South, which was anti-growth, like the Queen of England, and the industrial capitalist class of the North. And that the Second Great Awakening was a very big part of that. And that there were a lot of socialists in the Second Great Awakening as well. The Second Great Awakening had a very socialistic edge to it. And that all of this is like the story of America. There's a fight in the world between the aristocratic mind that wants to stop progress, that is oligarchical, that views human beings as an annoying herd to be managed, that wants to end historical progress, that says human beings are like animals, they can be bred and they can be socially engineered. And the democratic, optimistic, historical progress mindset that says we can march to a new future by empowering people to be smarter than they were before, by advancing new technology, by increasing the population, by raising living standards. That is the divide And that's when I talk about city builders and vandals. That's the divide. And that the entrenched aristocratic elite will foment vandals. They'll try to march history backward in order to stay in power. Whereas the forces of historical progress will mobilize and advance. And in some cases, they'll cut off the head of the King of England. And this division, this kind of defines American history. This defines the history of the world. And right now, we're seeing that around the world, this imperialist system, this British Empire, colonial, oligarchical system is under attack. It's under attack and it's being defeated. China has broken out of it. African countries are breaking out of it. Iran has broken out of it. Russia has broken out of it. Latin American countries, Nicaragua, Venezuela have broken out of it. That old system that is opposing growth and just wants to keep the world poor so they can stay rich. The mindset of the English aristocracy is dying. And within the American spirit, everywhere, our heritage as a bunch of roundheads, as a bunch of ranters, as a bunch of Quakers, as a bunch of Puritans, our heritage of building and optimism and construction and spirituality, that heritage that we have as Americans is everywhere. It's everywhere in this country, but we've been ruled over. We have a technological elite, a technocracy that rules over us that is trying to crush that spirit. And the American optimism is boiling, and it wants to assert itself. And the oligarchy is trying, especially here in the homeland, in the center of their empire, to just tamper down and beat down the American spirit. This is the period that we're living in. There's a division in the ruling class. There's a global movement against their system, led largely, almost entirely by communists. Not every government involved is communist. The Iranian government rejects Marxism entirely, the Islamic Republic of Iran. Russia, though the Communist Party is a big party, they no longer are the Soviet Union. They reject Marxism. But if you look at the bulk of the countries that have broken out of Western domination, they did so with communism, Marxism, Leninism, or some form of socialism. Whether in Syria, you have Ba'athist Arab socialism. A number of African countries, they have their own interpretation of socialism. In Tanzania, Julius Nyerere had his African socialism. Gaddafi had his Islamic socialism. They have Bolivarian socialism in Latin America. But it is largely communism and socialism that has become the expression of humanity's desire for growth. Whereas the Western capitalist system that is now collapsing justifies itself in language of human rights, in language of opposing climate change, in language of social justice, and it's very interesting. This is the period that we're living in. And if you look at the English Civil War and you study the Diggers and what happened with the Diggers, you'll understand the period that we're living in. So I hope that my opening remarks tonight have made some sense to all of you. I hope I've spoken to you about why religion is becoming an increasingly important part of what we talk about on here, about why I study history and how to study history. Because, if you study history this way, right? If you study history this way, you can learn from history. What's the point of studying history? Is it just an interesting thing to learn from? Is it just fascinating? Is it memorizing dates like you did in high school, memorizing dates and names? No, you learn from history so that you can make history. You learn from history so you can make history. And we're living in a similar period, and we need to foment that democratic upsurge. That upsurge of democracy and spiritual power to defeat the aristocratic, oligarchical forces that want to hold back human progress. And there's a division in the ruling class. So that's what I wanted to communicate to all of you tonight. That's what I wanted you all to know. I hope that was helpful. So yeah, I guess, we got a number of questions that have come in. I see that there's a Rumble rant that's come in. And so why don't we do the roll call? I'll call you all out as I see you, names and locations. And then from there, I'll start answering people's questions. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. History repeats. Names and locations. Who is with us today? Micah in Las Vegas. Welcome, Micah. St. David's, Bermuda. Killian in Milwaukee. Welcome. Good to have you all here. The Seasoned Noob in China. Quinn Anderson. Quinn and Meredith from Washington. New Haven, Connecticut. Mima Flowers, California. Remy and Gary, Indiana. New Haven, Connecticut. Ryan in Kansas City. Scott in New York. Patrick in Maine. John McCarthy in Chicago. Steve in Boston. David Rennie in Hamilton, Ontario. Welcome. We got Tony in Tasmania. We got Jamie in St. Paul. We got Real Left. We got Timoshenko in St. Louis. Welcome, Tim. Josh in St. Louis. Utica, New York. Finn in Duluth. Temple City, California. Mariah in North Carolina. Natasha in Yugoslavia. Very good. Bob Troy in New York. Alex from Brazil. AJ in New Jersey. Gateway to the San Juan Islands. I don't know what that means, but there you go. Cape May, New Jersey. June Key in Houston. AJ from New Jersey. Alex from Brazil. Welcome. On the Rumble rant, we got Boris in Illinois on the Rumble. And we got anyone on the Rockfin. Frederick from Alameda County. Frederick is with us on the Rockfin. Welcome, Fred. Cincinnati, Ohio. Jenny Lynn. Cleveland. Dustin Schlesinger in Cleveland. Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Carlos from Mexico. Welcome, Carlos. Welcome. All right, folks. Well, I have a number of questions I can start answering. So I tell you what, I feel like answering some of these questions. Chris in Salt Lake City, Colin in Greensboro. I feel like I should answer some of these questions to start out with, and then I'll put on some music. I do want to play one song for you that I've played on here before about the 1649 events. But I think I'll start answering questions first. The first question is a Rumble rant. And it comes from Delta V and says the New York City DSA apologizing for tweeting in support of a pro-Palestinian rally and AOC accusing the rally of being unacceptable anti-Semitism. I saw that, and all day, the local media here, I have never seen anything like it. I have a couple thoughts on that, right? So for those of you who didn't know, just like always, when things are intensifying, Gaza, the West Bank, there is a pro-Palestinian march. There always is in New York City because there's a lot of Muslims here, right? New York City is a stronghold of pro-Israel Zionist sentiments, but there's a big Muslim community here, just like in many other cities. There was a great protest in Chicago and other places. So there was a big pro-Palestine march, like there always is when things intensify. But this time, local media has gone into overdrive, talking about how offensive it was, how hateful it was, how anti-Semitic it was. And the DSA apparently tweeted in support of it and participated. Their members attended it, which is, you would expect. DSA largely reflects leftists who are critical of Israel. They are for a two-state solution, but they're very critical of Israel. So you wouldn't be shocked that this happened. However, this time the media has gone into an overdrive against it. And I am getting emails from the Democratic Party of Brooklyn telling me that they are horrified at this march and they denounce it. I'm getting emails from the Republican Party of New York City denouncing this march and listing every DSA affiliated local Democrat official and demanding that they resign for supporting it. And I have never seen anything like this. Now, on the one hand, I'm seeing this and I find it to be a little bit scary because it just shows you how contrived all of this is. The Palestine marches have been going on ever since I've been to this city. From like the time I arrived in this city in a Greyhound bus in 2010 to now, every time things intensify in Gaza, there has been a march. They've had the exact same chants from the river to the sea. Palestine will be free. Free, free Palestine, free Palestine. Occupation is a crime, etc. Good for them. I agree with that. However, this time mainstream media has called these pro-terrorist marches. And they've whipped up a hysteria against it. And you'll notice all kinds of people that were totally okay with these marches every other time, suddenly this time, because there's pressure on them, oh, we're outraged. And AOC denounced the march and apologized. And there's all of this. And it shows you how many of these people, it's not about what's true or what's not. It's not about what actually happened. It's just about how much pressure gets put on them, right? AOC, if the media hadn't whipped up hysteria, she never would have denounced this march. But it got some negative attention. So, oh boy, the cancel culture machine, right? That's all it's about, right? It is not about principle, number one. Number two, maybe some of the DSA people will learn from this because they are the biggest cancel culture assholes ever, right? I mean, the people who are calling us white supremacists and Nazis and all kinds of stuff are the same people that now are having that done to them. And they're being called Nazis on social media. They're having to apologize for their pro-Palestine march. So maybe they'll learn from this. Maybe they'll learn that maybe just because everybody says something on social media doesn't mean it's true, right? Maybe they'll learn that that the media can spin things into something that they're not, right? Have some backbone. And a lot of these people have no backbone. Again, it's not about right and wrong, or else they would have denounced every march that ever happened for Palestine. It's just about the fact this is getting media harassment, and these people collapse in the face of cancel culture. And there's nothing I hate more than that. I got to tell you, you've got to have courage. You've got to have courage. You've got to have courage. You've got to be willing to withstand persecution. Our ruling class is evil. We are ruled by mass murderers, the people that destroyed Libya, the most prosperous country on the African continent, and they bombed it to shit, right? You want those people to approve of you? Give me a break, right? You've got to have some courage. You've got to be willing to face persecution. You got to be willing to not be popular. You got to be willing to have people not like you. You got to be willing to be condemned. And if you don't take a stand and you don't stand for your principles, you're in the wrong business. And I have seen way too many people who, they'll work with me until I get some bad press, until someone gossips about me on the internet, and until, blah, 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 blah. And I'm tired of that, right? You got to learn to withstand. You got to learn to have some principle. You got to learn to buckle down. You got to learn to be tough. And some people in the DSA, this will be a lesson for them because they know this wasn't a hate march. They know there were Jews marching in that rally also. They'll know there were signs people held up that said Zionism is not Judaism. They'll know this wasn't a hate march. This was a pro-Palestine march. This was a march opposing the onslaught that Netanyahu says is coming. That's what this was. And they know that. But social media and regular media has declared that this is, oh my God, this is a terrorist Nazi rally. Well, that's because mainstream media lies. Social media is rigged. And maybe some of them will learn that. And the next time social media whips them up to go after somebody, they'll think, wait, they did the same thing to me. So I hope that they'll learn from this. But my fear, I will say this, and now I see there's another super chat. My fear is that this will be used to set precedents for outlawing protests. And that is something that I very much fear because they are already cracking down on protests like you wouldn't believe. So there's another Rumble rant says, thoughts on Israeli intelligence being warned 2 weeks in advance on these attacks by Egyptian intelligence. Some IDF members have said there's no way Israeli intelligence didn't know it was coming. I've heard similar things like that, but I can't confirm that. Okay, I see what you're saying there, and a lot of people are saying that they think Israel, quote unquote, let this happen. It was like a false flag, but I can't confirm that. I'm not ready to say that. Right? I know that's going around, but you have to be really careful with that. Right? You have to be really careful with all of this. You have to be really careful with all of this. Look, generally, when there's some kind of big military thing planned in any war, it's very hard to keep it hush-hush. Now, I mean, occasionally there are sneak attacks and things that are able to be pulled off that are a big surprise. But generally, military operations, as much as armies try to keep them secret, generally word gets out somehow. But, I don't know. I mean, did Israel let this happen? Did they know exactly when it was going to happen? Are they using this as a pretext to justify just going in and slaughtering all of them? It's possible. I'm not ruling it out, but I'm not yet ready to say that myself. All right. So on that note, I'm going to put on, I played it on here before, but this is a song that was performed. This is a performance from the CPGBML of Britain. At their office, they had a group of singers perform a song in honor of the Diggers' uprising during the English Civil War. So.
Enjoy the food. Anyway, this first, we're going to do a couple of songs. This is the first one. It comes from the English Civil War, and it's about the Diggers, who were a group of peasant farmers who, after the victory of the Civil War, moved on to common land in what is now a very plush golf course in Weybridge, called St George's Hill. It's called the Diggers' Song, or The World Turned Upside Down. I've just had to change the string, which is absolutely typical. So it's constantly going out of tune. In 1649, to St George's Hill, a ragged band they called the Diggers came to show the people's will. They defied the landlords, they defied their laws. They were the dispossessed, reclaiming what was theirs. We come in peace, they said, to reap and sow. We come to make the world in common and to make this wasteland grow. This world divided, we shall make whole, so it can be a common treasury for all. The sin of property we do disdain. No man has any right to buy and sell the earth for private gain. By theft and murder, they stole the land. Now everywhere the wolves spring up at their command. They make the laws satiate us well. Their clergy dazzle us with heaven, or they damn us into hell. We will not follow the God they serve, the God of greed who feeds the rich while poor men starve. We work, we eat together, we need no swords. We will not bow to the landlords or pay rent unto the laws. We are free men, though we are poor. We know there's laws, stand up for freedom, stand up and not property, the orders came. They sent their hired men and troopers to wipe out the diggers' grain, tear down their cottages, destroy their corn. They were dispersed, only the vision lingers on. Ye poor take courage, ye rich take care. This earth was made a common treasury for everyone to share. All people divided, all people one. They came in peace, the orders came to cut them down. They came in peace, the orders came to cut them down.
All righty. Okay, so we got a few super chats here. I've done the Rumble rants. I guess there was a follow-up about Israeli media confirming that Egyptian authorities let them know in advance. Okay, again, I'm not ready to comment on that as of yet. We'll see how that story develops, but thank you. Thank you for the folks on the Rumble rant. And so I'm going to start answering, and if people have more super chats, more Rockfin tips, more Rumble rants, just send them my way because, give me more to talk about here. First question. I watched your noon stream. Mind talking about the new communist movement? Sure. The new communist movement, it was as Students for a Democratic Society split, and you had the Weathermen that were leading, toward ultra-left adventurism and embracing the counterculture. You then had a group of people who were supporters of the Black Panthers. They were supporters of the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. But instead of believing in left adventurism and instead of embracing hippie counterculture, they argued that it was necessary to go to the working class and build a new communist party that would be aligned with China. And out of the new communist movement, it immediately fractured. The biggest grouping was originally called the Revolutionary Union. It was based in the Bay Area, and it was led by Baba Vakian. And eventually in 1975, it became the Revolutionary Communist Party. And it's still around. It's probably all that's left, really, of the new communist movement. But you also had, there was a guy named Mike Klonsky, whose father had been a leader of the Communist Party USA, and he had become a young Maoist. And he formed something called the October League, that eventually became known as the Communist Party Marxist-Leninist. There was a guy in New York City who was an Asian American. His name was Jerry Tung, and he was a Chinese American. And he and a number of Chinese Americans and others, they had something briefly called the Asian Study Group, and it was like a communist group for Asian Americans. But then they eventually launched a party called the Communist Workers' Party, the CWP. And then there was Nelson Peary, who was a black activist who'd been a leader of the Communist Party, who'd been kicked out for his position on black nationalism. And he started something called the Communist Labor Party, the CLP. So really, those are the parties that come out of it. Now, there was a smaller group called the Communist Party USA Marxist-Leninist. It was a very small group that followers of Hardy Baines. That was a very strange and small group that eventually aligned with Albania and supported Enver Hoxha. And then you had a number of little collectives that emerged around the country. The Proletarian Unity League, you had, I think there was a group called Rising Up Angry. And there were a lot of little tiny groups that didn't really take off. But you had about, I think, 5 big parties that formed. And the biggest of them was the Revolutionary Communist Party. Then there was the October League. Then there was the Communist Labor Party and the Communist Workers' Party and the Communist Party USA Marxist-Leninist. These were the different groups that were around. There was also the Democratic Workers' Party that was started by a feminist activist named Marlene Dixon, and she combined Mao Zedong thought with feminism, and she started her own group that was mainly on the West Coast. It was in San Francisco. But there were a number of these groups that were looking to China for revolutionary inspiration. They thought the regular Communist Party was old and falling apart and controlled by the FBI. And they wanted to go to average working class Americans with communism. And they largely rejected hippie counterculture. That's kind of what defined the new communist movement. The Weathermen had embraced drug use. They'd drawn their hair long. They said, freaks are revolutionaries. Revolutionaries are freaks. All that. No, these people said, no, we want to build a working class mass movement. We reject the counterculture. And they cut their hair short. They got jobs in factories generally. They worked in steel mills. They worked in auto plants. And they tried to recruit their coworkers to a new communist party that was aligned with China. Now, what's interesting is the new communist movement really didn't have much success, except in Detroit. And if you want to read about the success of the new communist movement, the city where they made the most of an impact is Detroit. And you read this book. This is fascinating. Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, a study in urban revolution. This book is fascinating. They got a mayor elected to Detroit. Coleman Young, the first black mayor of Detroit, was very much a friend and fellow traveler of the new communist movement. Joanne Watson, who until recently was on the Detroit City Council, she was part of the new communist movement. Ken Cockrell was this lawyer who was a very famous, well-known lawyer in Detroit who identified with the new communist movement. And the Communist Labor Party, that wing of the new communist movement, recruited a lot of African Americans in Detroit. There was a judge who was elected, who was a Maoist communist who, carried Mao's little red book on the stand, on the bench with him. And Detroit, they managed to seem to somewhat have a mass base. There were some other successes in Georgia. There was like a wildcat strike that was led by members of the October League, where they were playing a very important role. And that largely, though, it was unsuccessful. And the reason the new communist movement was unsuccessful largely was because there was still a very, very prosperous industrial middle class in the United States that didn't want to hear it. A lot of the workers in the factories, they said, move to some other country if you want communism. America, love it or leave it. It's the greatest country in the world, et cetera. And they were largely unsuccessful. And it's unfortunate because they were doing the right thing. But they were largely unsuccessful because at that point, the so-called aristocracy of labor, the well-paid workers who their loyalty had been bought to empire that Lenin talks about in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, that was the predominant feeling among at least the white working class. And so they were not able to recruit very heavily. It was unfortunate. However, they did still do some amazing things. I talk about, 1976, in this book I talk about in 1976, the Revolutionary Communist Party had a rally to oppose the bicentennial celebrations. In Philadelphia, they had a bicentennial to celebrate the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. The RCP organized a huge rally of about 5,000 people that marched, and they said, what is it? We've carried the rich for 200 years. Now let's dump them off our backs. That was the slogan that they used. And then they had a veterans contingent at their rally. And these were Vietnam veterans who marched in their uniforms. They said, we won't fight another rich man's war. And I have a picture of that. That's one of the best things the Revolutionary Communist Party ever did. I mean, this picture just says it all, right? All these vets in their uniforms. We won't fight another rich man's war. It was a great thing that the Revolutionary Communist Party did. There were mistakes that were made. Some of the Maoist groups supported the racist anti-busing riots in Boston. And I've talked about that, the Boston trap. It was a complicated time. But long story short, China's politics started changing, right? 1976, Mao died, right? But China's politics had already been starting to change. China's foreign policy was shifting in the 70s. China was aligning with the United States against the Soviet Union. China was, politically changing already. But then after Mao died, Deng Xiaoping came to power. China started pursuing market socialism, and it was aligned with the United States in its foreign policy at that point. So many of these communist groups didn't quite know what to do because China was who they had been taking revolutionary direction from. And the Revolutionary Communist Party, Bob Avakian, denounced China, and he became anti-China. And the RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, split over that. And about half the membership quit, led by a guy named Label Bergman, another guy named Mickey Jarvis. The October League, they went all in and they solidly supported China. And then China finally told them in 1980, 1981, we really don't want a U.S. affiliated party anymore. And they dissolved. And then some of them went into Line of March, which was like an academic discussion group, and some of them, they went different ways. The Democratic Workers' Party. As China shifted, they couldn't take political direction from China anymore. So they developed a relationship with the government of Romania. I believe it was either Romania or Bulgaria or one of the Eastern European governments. And then they were basically dissolved. And then they were, it was like a hostile takeover. The leader, it was accused of being a cult, and it dissolved into the Democratic Socialists of America. There were a number of these groups that just kind of collapsed. The economic downturn that came at the end of the 1970s, 1978, 79, these groups became very, very desperate. And because they were so desperate, they did some stupid things. The Communist Workers' Party challenged the Ku Klux Klan to a fight. They had a Death to the Klan rally, a rally called Death to the Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan showed up and shot 5 of them in broad daylight. It was called the Greensboro Massacre of 1979. The RCP 1979, they had a rally to protest Deng Xiaoping. And I talk a lot about it in this book, Letter to Bob Avakian, because it's been revealed that they were basically being used by anti-China wings of the deep state. The FBI, that did not want diplomatic relations with China, infiltrated the RCP. That's blatantly obvious. Western Goals, which is this like right-wing organization that's run by the FBI at the time, infiltrated the RCP, and they were being used by the right wing to attack China. They trashed the Chinese embassy and smashed it the day it was opened. They disrupted the press conference where Deng Xiaoping spoke. And then on top of that, and I didn't even get into this in the book, but they put out like fake issues of the newspaper of the October League, which was the group that still supported China. It was kind of like almost looked like a COINTELPRO kind of thing. The RCP became infiltrated by right-wing anti-China activists and manipulated. The groups all kind of acted and did different weird things, and they were all heavily infiltrated. One thing about the new communist movement is there was a fetish for secrecy that was very unhealthy. And it was because of, the FBI repression, but also because a lot of them were middle class. And for a lot of them, it was a game. They wanted to have your secret party name, and you had the code name and the secret handshake, and it was amateurish. But a lot of there was kind of a fetish for secrecy, a fetish for clandestine activity. In a way that hurt them because you wouldn't know who was giving you orders. And in a lot of cases, there wasn't widespread discussion. And that was a really big critique of a lot of these groups, was that they didn't have internal discussion about why they did things. When the 1976 split in the RCP happened, when the RCP split, many of the members didn't know why the split happened. It was, things like that, where it was like, again, you had your secret party name and your secret, meeting, and you went and met with somebody in your super secret, hide your cell phone, whatever. And that, people in these groups kind of learned to follow the leader. And so things would happen and they wouldn't know why they were happening. And the same in the October League and a lot of these groups. They were doing doing secret code stuff that made it so people didn't really know what was going on. And that actually made it easier for the FBI to infiltrate them because there wasn't transparency. Nobody knew why things were happening, why decisions were being made. And so it was very easy for the FBI to get inside these groups and get them to act crazy and do crazy things because people wouldn't know. Right. Wouldn't know what was going on. So that's one critique of them. It's just a very sad thing. And that by about 1980, the new communist movement was over. Now, the RCP stayed around and became an ultra-leftist group. They said that the majority of American workers are bourgeoisified, that only the lumpen proletariat, deeply impoverished people could make a revolution. Most of the groups dissolved. The Freedom Road Socialist Organization is a group that still exists. That's heritage kind of goes back to the new communist movement. But they've strayed from it. They're just Democrats. I mean, they orient their members to be Democrats. Freedom Road is a secret club you can join, and they orient their members to work at Democrat NGOs and work at labor unions. And it's a way you can pretend you're a communist while you work for the Democrats. But the new communist movement is worth studying because they were doing the right thing, which was they weren't trying to build a counterculture hippie movement. They weren't trying to recruit leftists. They were trying to recruit the masses. So they had the right orientation. Unfortunately, historical circumstances were not on their side. China was changing and the U.S. economy was still strong, and just the ground was not fertile. But what is important to note is the ground is now very fertile for the kind of organizing that they did, going among the masses, preaching a communist message, winning people to anti-imperialism and communism. But the communist groups don't want to do that. They just want to be the foot soldiers of Joe Biden. And they have just declared all the masses of people who are turning against the government, who are turning against the wars, they've just declared them to all be white supremacists and fascists. And it's one of the saddest things I've ever seen. And that, out of the movement to the masses doesn't just mean, going among average people. It also means breaking with this idea that the Democrats are always better than the Republicans. The Republicans are fascists. That's just not true. That's just not true. And that's what most of the left has been reduced to believing. All right. Please explain why the arms race was damaging to the Soviet Union, but not the USA. Well, for an obvious reason. In the Soviet Union, the weapons and missiles that they had to build in order to keep up came at the expense of things like hospitals, things like schools, things that the country needed. Whereas in the United States, because it's a capitalist economy, the military spending was a stimulus, right? They would hire people to work in those plants, and the capitalist corporations would make money from getting contracts to build new nuclear missiles, and that it stimulated the U.S. economy, whereas it was a drain on the Soviet economy. I think that's the issue. Michael Parenti has a great talk on the arms race, how it wasn't an arms race, it was an arms catch-up, that, the Soviet Union was constantly having to build bigger weapons to keep, the USA would build this, and then they would have to keep up. And then the US, it wasn't like the Soviet Union was trying to outdo the United States with their nukes. They were not. They were constantly trying to catch up, and they wanted an agreement to be reached so they wouldn't have to do that anymore. And that's what the SALT Treaty and all of that was about. So, and it was a drain on the Soviet economy. They had to spend a lot of their money that they would have spent on other things on keeping up with the United States in the arms race, and it hurt the Soviet economy. But the arms race is not what ultimately destroyed the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was destroyed because there was a wing of the government, the Gorbachev wing, that didn't believe in communism anymore. And I mean, that was really what it was. It was ideological penetration. There was a big section of the Soviet leadership among the younger generation that didn't believe in communism, and that had been enamored with the West, that believed the United States wasn't a big threat. And I mean, I've talked to people who were there at the time. They remember this, that, among the older generation, the older communists, you had a lot of them that were genuine communists, but there were a lot of the people that were in the Gorbachev wing of the Soviet Communist Party just didn't believe in communism. And that was a problem. And obviously that led to the falling. And part of the reason that you had that develop was that there was not political discussion in the USSR. That, during the Stalin years, a lot of people had ended up in gulags. A lot of people had ended up, executed in purges and stuff. And that generally the message was sent out to the population: don't ask too many questions about communism. If you engage with these ideas too much and you come to the wrong conclusion, you could get in trouble. And so the discussion of communism was very surface level, right? And if you watched Soviet media at the time, it was very surface level. It was just very basic, because people understood that if we ask too many questions about this, we might get in trouble. And that was a problem. There was not broad debate and discussion among the population. And that led to people kind of not really believing in communism or taking it seriously. I mean, they knew the basics, but you got, like, I believe there was a thing, Soviet officials would often talk about the lynching of black people in the United States. And it became kind of a joke among Soviet dissidents, right? Is that they would just say, for every bad thing in the country, they'd say, oh, but they lynch black people. Ha, 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 ha. Oh, but they lynch black people. And it became like a joke, because that was, they would joke that was the only Soviet government official. That was the only thing the Soviet government official had to say, right? If anyone complained about anything in the Soviet Union, they'd say, well, we don't lynch black people. America, they lynch black people. And it became like a meme. People would make fun of them. Well, obviously, if you're seriously engaging with your population and engaging with them more politically, you say more than that. But an atmosphere had been created where there wasn't much political depth. And beneath the surface in the Soviet Union, In the Soviet Communist Party, you had two wings beneath the surface of people who didn't believe in communism. On the one hand, you had very liberal, kind of westernized people who watered down communism into social democracy, like Gorbachev, and then you had other forces, who believed in kind of they fit communism in with like Orthodox nationalism. And the Russian Orthodox concept of the empire. Beneath the surface, there were a lot of people in the Soviet government who kind of stopped believing in communism because it wasn't safe to actually engage with communist ideas. And that was a big problem. That was a very, very, very big problem. And ultimately, the Gorbachev wing got in and then liquidated. So there you go. There you go. All right. Reverend Wright is a Protestant liberation theology. Well, yeah, but liberation theology is largely a Catholic formation, right? I mean, Reverend Wright, Reverend Wright is, I think he comes out of like, there's a black church tradition, with Cornel West, where they talk about prophetic Christianity and things to that effect. That's where I think Reverend Wright comes out of. That's my understanding, at least, of where he stands. I remember the Reverend Jeremiah Wright controversy was very annoying because everything he said was true. The USA does support the Israelis murdering Palestinians. The USA did drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And at the time, they were showing those clips and they're like, oh my God, he said that. It's like, but it's true. It's against America. It's true, right? It was all true. All the things he was saying about U.S. crimes in history were all true. And, no one wanted to debate whether it was true or not. They just wanted to debate, oh my God, this man said that. That's anti-American. So there you go. There you go. But that whole Reverend Jeremiah Wright controversy was very dumb. And it was, I mean, it wouldn't happen that way now. Things are a little bit different now, right? Now, I don't know. Maybe you could compare it to what they're saying about the Palestine rally that happened, but I don't know. We'll see. All righty. Felonious Punk says, fantastic as usual. Thank you, Felonious Punk. I do my best. That's all I do. I probably won't be on tomorrow because tomorrow morning I'm recording a podcast with Joe T and Harpal Brar. So probably tomorrow I'll get up, I'll record the podcast, and then I have other things to take care of, and then I'll probably be back on Thursday. But I'm going to try to do 2 a day as much as I can, right? Because gotta do what we can. So wish me luck on that. You guys are a great audience, and you ask good questions, right? You ask good questions, you get me talking. So there you go. All right. They called people traitors for calling for audits and oversight of the arms shipments for Ukraine. Now their own weapons are being used against them. And that is true. Those weapons, it looks like the weapons they sent to Ukraine have ended up in the hands of Hamas. And, duh, told you so, right? This is a long-standing issue. The United States sends weapons all over the world, and those weapons end up in all kinds of people's hands. So there you go. Yeah, and they called people traitors for saying that. And there you go. You were absolutely right, John McCarthy. It's an absolutely fair point to make. And yeah, we're going to have to see how things develop. But, we're all watching what's happening in Gaza right now. And oh my God, not a good situation. All right, folks. Well, it looks like that's our show for tonight. Those are all the questions that have come in. So I guess I will put on the closing music and that'll be it. But I'll be back. Keep an eye out for the podcast. There's going to be a video posted on this channel pretty soon that I think you'll all really like. Not going to spoil it for you, but I've been working with Peter Coffin on it. It's going to be pretty cool. So that's happening, and we're just going to keep going like we always do. Just like we always do. All righty. So, yeah, I guess I'll just put on the closing music, and we'll be back. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.